So if there's one thing, and there's many things, but if there's one thing that I learned when I was in student ministry, it was that junior high, senior high kids, they like to have name brand stuff. Clothes, shoes, whatever, stuff that they get. The cheap brand or the off brand or the Walmart brand is not good enough, even though it is probably the same exact shirt. It just doesn't have that logo on there, right? And some of you had kids grow up through that age, and you know what that's about. And you could walk around our youth ministry, or we could walk around our high schools, and you can see kids wearing expensive clothes, wearing expensive shoes, even driving expensive vehicles. And I think what's driving this is so much of our kids, they put their identity in what they wear. They put their identity in what they drive. They put their identity in what they do. And really, when you break it down, they like to have that mark. They like to have that Ariat mark on their pants or on their boots. They like to have that Nike mark on their hat or their shirts. They like to drive that Ford pickup. And you know that they're really about looks if they're driving a Ford, not a Chevy. So, yes. Amen. That's right. We will talk. This might be my last Sunday, just so you know. But here's the reality. Our kids do this. Our kids struggle with this. We're no different, right? I mean, if we really break it down as adults, we're not any different. We like to have nice stuff. And we can justify it, certainly. We can justify having the expensive tools because they are better quality and they last longer. Well, that may be true. There's a level there where I think we just really like having name brand stuff. We like having really nice cars. We like having the jewelry, whatever the case may be. And what it breaks down to is that we like having that identity. We like having that mark. We like associating ourselves with certain things. And I do this too. I wear, if you see me around town or during the week, I wear a ball cap. It's got CNS on it. That is my brother-in-law's duck company. A duck call company. He makes duck calls up in Minnesota. He's very, very good at it. I like associating myself with him. And so I like promoting that as much as I've never once had somebody comment on it, but it's a nice thought, right? I like having that association. In years past, you'll have to forgive me for this, I have wore a black or a red hat that has the letter N on it. And it's not because I think I'm smart with knowledge. It's because I like the Nebraska Huskers, and I will admit that to you. And I know there's others. There was like 3 whole people in first service that also like the Huskers. We are growing in numbers. This is a good thing. And we're starting a support group later. We identify ourselves. We identify ourselves with different things. And we look around. We can look around culture. We can look around our city. And you can drive up behind somebody, and on their bumper sticker, it has Cheyenne Hills Church or Element Church, and that's not a bad thing. People like identifying themselves with certain things. People like defining themselves with certain groups. And as Christians even, we do this as well. You can drive up behind somebody and you can see the fish, right? Or some of us are wearing crosses even today, probably. We like identifying ourselves and putting a mark on us that we are a Christian. We like having that mark with us. Well, we are in Revelation chapter 13. We're 8 weeks into this study through Revelation. And if you have not been with us or you missed some weeks, you can go back on our website and you can find all of those previous messages through chapters 1 through 12. But today, as we get into chapter 13, some of you maybe came just for this day. Because at the end of chapter 13, if you know, we deal with the dreaded number of 666. And so we will deal with that and we will land there later on. But we need to work through the beginning part of chapter 13. And so if you have your Bibles, let's turn there. We're going to deal with chapter 13 in 2 sections. We're going to have two beasts that present themselves, and we're going to work through what that is. But chapter 13 is a continuation of chapter 12, and talking about the persecution and the labor pains that are coming on God's people and God's church. And so this is a continuation of it. Let's read this together. If you have your Bibles, or it'll be on the screen, starting in verse 1. And I saw a beast coming up from the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. The beast I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like a bear's, and his mouth was like a lion's mouth. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. One of the heads appeared to be fatally wounded, but his fatal wound was healed. The whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon because of his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to wage war against him?" And a mouth was given to him to speak boasts and blasphemies. And he was also given authority to act for 42 months. And he began to speak blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. And he was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was also given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All those who live on earth will worship him, and everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. If anyone has an ear, he should listen. If anyone is destined for captivity, into captivity he goes. If anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. This demands perseverance and faith of the saints. Let's stop here for just a second and let's work through together what this first beast really looks like. And so last week we kind of laid the foundation that the dragon equals Satan. And so when we hear about the dragon throughout Revelation, John is talking about Satan, and this is Satan's work. And so we have now this dragon that is coming up and the beast that is coming up and presenting himself. This is just one of the tools that Satan uses against his church. This is just one of the ways that Satan goes after God's church and after God himself and everything that God is trying to do. And so as we look at this, and if you want to study this out further, I would encourage you this week to look at Revelation chapter 13 right next to Daniel chapter 7. Specifically verses 1 through 8 and then 23 through 25. There are so many parallels like what we've talked throughout this whole time in Revelation to the Old Testament. And you're going to see quite a few similarities between Daniel and Revelation chapter 13. But what we have here is this beast, and he presents himself and he looks like this. We're going to kind of talk through this. He has seven heads, so we'll stop there. 7 heads. There's a couple things that we can kind of say on this. Throughout Revelation again, when looking at the number 7 oftentimes means complete or whole or the complete essence of. And so we had in chapters 2 and 3 the 7 churches. And this is really a look at the complete picture of God's church. And so now we have 7 heads on this beast. And so this could very well mean this is just the complete manifestation of evil presenting itself here. This is the complete evil. The second thing here to note is that in chapter 17 we see another description of a beast that looks very similar to this one as well. In it, you have 7 heads that are likened to the 7 hills that Rome is built on. So remember, we're looking at Revelation through the eyes and through the ears of the first century church. And they are living in a time where Rome is pushing down on them. They're persecuting Christians. And so these Christians are looking at Rome, and if you kind of look at the landscape of Rome, there are kind of some identifiable hills that are there. And it's built on these kind of 7 hills. And so there could be a correlation here between this beast having 7 heads really identifying Rome in and of itself. And then the head, each one has blasphemous names. Each one is written with a blasphemous name. There was a political practice during the first, second centuries and on a little bit longer where individuals would get into a political position like Caesar or some sort of ruler position, and they would try to elevate themselves to a position of God or deity of some kind. And so they would basically convince everybody around them that they are a god, and then they would require that people would worship them like they are a god. And so you would see Roman Caesars claim to be this god and demand worship and loyalty from the general public. And when people did not bow down and worship Caesar, then they were charged with blasphemy. And so this was a practice that was going on here. And verse 8 talks about it here too as well. Verse 8 says, all those who live on the earth will worship him. This is a picture of really humanity bowing down to this political individual, bowing down to this ruler. Look at verse 8 there. Let's finish verse 8 before we jump back to verse 3. Everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. Worshiping the beast does not get your name written in the Lamb's book of life. Worshiping the beast, bowing down to the beast, and whatever that looks like. And we're going to unpack that a little bit later on. But whether it's a political beast, whether it's a cultural beast, whether it's a social or society beast, whether it's just a spiritual attack that you are under or torment that you are under, bowing down to that beast does not get your name written in the Lamb's book of life. Excuse me. Let's continue on. Verse 3. One of the heads was fatally injured, but it had healed. Had a mark on it. Like somebody had tried to kill it, but then it had healed. So a couple observations from this, and you can kind of land wherever you want to. The first one is this. During the first century and into the second century, there was kind of this idea going around that a man named Nero was resurrected or was coming back and tormenting Christians. And so here's the story on Nero. Nero was in power and in rule in about the 60s AD. And so basically what had happened was Christ came, he had his ministry, he died on the cross about AD 30 or 33, went to the grave, rose, ascended. From about AD 33, for a couple decades, the church exponentially grew. It had seen probably one of the greatest growth periods ever in history during that time. The church was just on fire, and things were going really well. But then you get into the 50s and the 60s, and a guy named Nero steps onto the scene, and he begins fervently attacking and persecuting the church. And he is going after the church. He is dead set on eliminating the church from existence. And he was known as one of the great persecutors of Christians. And so whenever you heard the name Nero, it kind of sent shivers down your spine because you knew what was being talked about. Well, in AD about 67 or so, Nero commits suicide by cutting his throat, ironically, and he dies. Except his legacy continues on. And so a couple things then happened. There were some people that claimed that Nero, in fact, didn't die, he didn't commit suicide, and he still lived on to continue persecuting Christians. Theory number one out of several. Theory number two out of several is that people believed that Nero actually had imposters or people who would act like Nero to kind of come back and make people believe that he had come back from the dead. And so you had these people kind of reliving Nero and persecuting Christians around them. And so you have this kind of phrase, and it's a Latin phrase, I can't say it, I embarrass myself, but it basically is Nero come back to life. And this idea is that when persecution starts happening, Nero is coming back. And so then, when we hear about this beast and his head and they have a fatal wound, first century Christians might have thought about Nero come back. They might have been thinking about, well, who is the new Nero that's coming back onto the scene? But more than likely, they probably thought about a man who was very real to them, and his name is Domitian. Domitian was a ruler during the time. Domitian was a man who was also fervent on attacking Christians and persecuting Christians as well. And so this Nero come back to life was very real for first century Christians. And Domitian was a leader in the Christian persecution in the late first century. So that's kind of thought number one about the fatal wound on the beast's head. Thought number two is that this could be a comparison to Christ. And if we just unpack that for a little bit and look at this, we think about Christ. And he goes through his ministry, and then he has the fatal wounds of what happened to him on the cross. And he dies on the cross, they put him in the grave, and then he walks out of that grave 3 days later. And the wounds are healed, similar to what we are kind of seeing here with this beast's head, is that the fatal wound was healed. And then after this, a large number of people came and they followed Christ, and they began worshiping him. And Christ was getting a lot of attention there for a while. And what could be happening here as well is more of an identity thing where this beast is trying to identify himself as like Christ. He's got a lot of followers, and people are worshiping him, and he could be identifying himself as Christ. Whatever the case may be, we have kind of an identity thing going on here with the beast. Now, some would say that the whole Nero come back idea, it's not just subject to the first century, and I maybe agree with that. You can look through history and you can find people who would talk about individuals like Stalin, like Hitler, like Mao, and other people, and really identify them as the Nero come back to life people. And what we see take place throughout history is that while governments aren't necessarily bad themselves, in and of themselves they're not bad, this is a warning for us because we see a government really turning on the first century Christians, and Satan is using political powers to persecute Christians here, and we can really see this in America as well. It is becoming harder and harder to become and stay a Christian in America. The government is not as willing to allow certain things to happen for Christians. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then we end this section, this first section in Revelation chapter 13, with a warning. And again, like we have saw throughout Revelation, wherever it says, if anyone has an ear, he should listen, we should probably take that literally. If we have ears, we should listen to what this is saying. Verse 10, if you just want to read it there with me. If anyone is destined for captivity, into captivity he goes. If anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. This demands perseverance and faith of the saints. This is a warning from John. This is a warning about the struggle and the persecution that is coming to Christians, because what's happening is Christians are being faced with kind of two options, and they're trying to navigate this tension between following God with everything that they have and also stay in line with what the government and society and culture around them is saying to them. And so you have God, demanding full attention and full commitment, and then you have culture over here saying, no, give a little bit. Give in a little bit. Compromise a little bit. Bow down a little bit to some of these over here. And what John here is saying is that this demands perseverance and faithfulness. How do Christians throughout the centuries respond to Satan persecuting the church and using power against the church? How should Christians navigate the tension between loyalty to God and loyalty to land? Or navigate the tension between loyalty to God and loyalty to those around them, to family, to culture, to society around them? How do Christians throughout history navigate this tension between loyalty to God and loyalty to something else? John, I believe, paints a pretty easy to understand picture. Not that it's necessarily easy to carry out. But I think what John basically says is, offered the choice between loyalty to God and loyalty to something else, you choose God and whatever results come with that. And so two of the major ones that he cites here are two of the major ones that were happening in the first century. You choose God over Rome. I think at best you get captivity, and you probably get the sword. But John's saying it's not that hard of a decision. If you are a Christian, you choose God over everything else. And he knows this better than anybody. Because if you remember back to week 1 when we introduced this, John is writing to Christians from his jail cell in Patmos. He's in captivity because of his faith. And he's made that choice, and he's following God rather than following Rome. All right, let's continue on here. Verse 11, we get into the second beast. It says this, "Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he sounded like a dragon. He exercised all authority of the first beast on his behalf, and compels the earth and those who live on it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He also performs great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. He deceives those who live on the earth because of the signs that is permitted to perform on behalf of the beast, telling those who live on the earth to make an image of the beast who had the sword wound yet lived. He was permitted to give a spirit to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could both speak and cause whoever would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he requires everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, the beast's name or number of his name. Let's stop there for just a minute. And so let's unpack this second beast here a little bit. Another beast arises, and we see that both of these beasts are working for Satan. These are kind of some of Satan's way of persecuting Christians around him. And so looking at the second beast, he has two horns like a lamb, it says. Well, who is the lamb throughout Revelation consistently referring to? Jesus, right? John consistently refers to Jesus as the lamb. And so we almost get this picture that this beast is trying to look like Christ. He's trying to give the impression he is Christ. But it's quick to also go on to say that this is not necessarily accurate, that this is not how he acts. He has two horns like a lamb, but he's sounded like a dragon. He resembles Christ, he imitates Christ, but what comes out of his mouth, and here's a reality and a truth for us all, we can look one way on the outside. What comes out of our mouth reveals something different. What comes out of our mouth reveals who we truly are. And so what comes out of this beast's mouth sets him apart. Revelation chapter 16, 19, and 20, John says that this beast is a false prophet. It's a spokesman for the first beast. It acts on behalf of the first beast. It speaks for Satan, and it makes the earth worship the first beast. It performs signs deceiving the earth. It tells them to set up an image of the first beast to worship. Those who didn't worship this beast would be killed. It forces everyone to get a mark. We'll continue on to verse 18 in a minute. This beast is essentially a priest for the first beast, and ultimately for Satan. He's kind of living his life and doing his thing, pointing to the first beast, pointing all worship to the first beast, pointing all attention to the first beast. He positions the first beast as a god and then forces worship of it in threatening life or death or ruin. And it seems like this beast can represent a couple different groups of people. The first group that this beast can represent during this time period, there was these groups of priests that their main goal was to try and help people worship Caesar. And so built around this area in all these different cities were these temples in cities like Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum. If you recognize those names, you read Revelation chapter 2 and 3. These are places where the churches are at that John is writing to. So within these cities of these first century Christians, within the cities they live are these temples where these priests live there and they work and trying to get people to worship Caesar. And so inside these temples are these statues and these carvings of Caesars and other gods, and their sole purpose is to try and get people to worship these Caesars and these other gods. So that's the first group that this can represent. The second group, another group that existed, was within the church. Again, go back and read Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Read about what was happening in the church, and you come across people like Jezebel in Revelation 2, verse 20, who was preaching Christ along with emperor worship, was preaching Christ along with worshiping other things, ultimately worshiping culture and politics around them. And they're trying to get others to do this as well. So rather than focusing on only worshiping God, they're saying, well, do that, but also do this so that you can not be totally ruined economically or not be put in prison or not be killed because of your faith in God. And so we have these two groups that are kind of pulling people from the church and pulling people from worship of God. Now, these two beasts, they are active for the 42 months, again, meaning the expanse of time before Christ comes back. And the reality is, since this time, it was happening here, where the church at times was kind of trying to navigate the tension here and preaching, worship God, but also do these other things. Since that time, this has not changed. You can look around right now and you can find Christian groups that put on a good front. They look like a good Christian group, but when you really dig into them and you really find out what they are all about, they have a hidden agenda, and it's more of a social agenda or a political agenda that they are trying to push with the front of a Christian organization. And this is exactly what this second beast looks like. On the outside, it may look good, but when you start to hear it speak, and you start to hear what it's all about, the beast shows himself. And so then we get to verse 18. The long-awaited verse 18. Read it with me here. It says this, "Here is wisdom. The one who has understanding must calculate the number of the beast, because it is the number of a man. His number is 666. If we look at verse 17 for a little context, verse 17 talks about how the beast forces everybody to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead in order really to engage in society around them. And so we have people getting this mark. Now, when we start talking about 666, if we're being honest, some of us get a little nervous because we don't understand what 666 means. And you go out and you talk about 666 with people around, people start to get nervous because we don't understand it. It's a scary number because we honestly just don't understand it. Some people have associated 666 with certain individuals in history. I had somebody that I know from Nebraska, maybe that's the problem, come up and say Obama was 666. It's ridiculous. In the past, we have had people associate 666 with Martin Luther in the Reformation time. Hitler was named 666 by some people. Ronald Wilson Reagan was named 666 by some people. And Ronald Wilson Reagan has 6 letters in each of his 3 names, getting 666. He was identified as the 666. Verse 17 and verse 18 of chapter 13, along with chapter 15, verse 2, give an answer to what 666 really means. The number 666 has to do with the beast's name, and that's really it. Number 666 has to do with his name. And it says there in verse, I think it's 18, it says, you must calculate the number of the beast, the number of his name. During the first, second centuries, early centuries, there was this practice that would go on for fun and then for serious reasons as well, to do this thing called gematria, I think is how you say it. He's going to put the name of it up on the screen. This was a practice where you would take a word, and each letter in that word would have a specific number value, and you could add up the letters of that word, and you could get a specific number. And so then words would have a number value associated with them. And so for them in the first century, you could take Greek or Hebrew or whatever written language you were working with. Each letter had a number to it, and you could add it up, and you'd have the sum of the words. This was done for fun as well as for serious reasons. And you can Google this, and you can find stuff online written about this. But one of the first things, if you do Google it, you'll read about a town in this area of the world called Pompeii, which back in the late 80s, 70s, was buried with ash from a volcano. And basically the town was deserted. And I'm not sure if people have moved in again since then, but you can kind of go into this town, and if you know where you're going, you can go to a place where inscribed on a wall is this phrase, I love her, whose name is 545. And you can look this up online, and it talks about this as well. And so this was kind of a common practice during this time. People would take words and turn them into numbers. And so if we do this here in Revelation chapter 13, and we take the word beast, and we take the Greek word for beast, and we translate it to Hebrew, and then we add up all the numbers, guess what number we get? 666. We get the number of the beast. And then we have this idea of being marked on our foreheads or marked on our hands. And if you spend any time in the Old Testament, this may sound familiar to you. Deuteronomy chapter 6 might come to mind. The great Shema is what it's referred to as. It starts off like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? Then it goes on to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Then it talks about binding God's law and putting it up around your house and writing it on your doorposts and talking about it when you walk down the road and when you lay down and when you wake up with your children. But then there's a verse in there, verse 8, that is interesting. Read verse 8 with me here, Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. There was a common practice back in the Old Testament times, and especially with God's people, where they would take these boxes with like ribbon or string, and they would tie them to their hands or tie them to their foreheads. And within these boxes, they would put a paper with a message or a passage that they wanted to meditate on for a while. It was a practice called phylacteries, I think is how you say it. These were phylacteries that they would attach to their hand or attach to their forehead. And they would walk around and they would do their thing, and every time that they, looked at their hand or remembered that this thing was on their head, they would meditate on whatever was written on the paper inside of the phylactery. And this is what this is saying here as well in Revelation. Because in the Old Testament, when people were walking around, it was clear who were God's people in the Old Testament. They were the ones that were marked with phylacteries. They were ones that had the boxes attached to their hands and to their foreheads. It was clear that they followed God. And so we have Revelation chapter 13 again here, with individuals being marked with 666. This is ultimately the mark of the beast or the mark of Satan. But if we jump ahead go to the next verse, chapter 14, verse 1, we have a reference to the Lamb and to God. And then it goes on to talk about the 144,000, God's complete picture, his complete amount of followers, the complete picture of God's people. And they are marked on their hands and on their foreheads with the mark of God and the Lamb. So let's do the same thing. If you take the Greek word for lamb and the Greek word for God and you translate it from Greek into Hebrew and then you add it up, you get 777. Again, the number 7, complete throughout Revelation. This is the complete essence of God here. And God is marking his people, the figurative 144,000, right? Not literally, but the figurative group of God's people are being marked with God's name and the Lamb's name on their foreheads and on their hand. You get the complete picture of God's people being marked as followers of God. And so rather than being scared or uneasy of the 666, what does this really say to us now here in 2018? What does this say to us now, having looked back at this, and we can read this and try and understand what it was like for them in the first century, and we can kind of understand the tension that they were going through then. But what does it say to us now? Let's cross that bridge into now for us. Here's the reality. Our culture is changing. It is becoming more and more difficult to follow Jesus. It's becoming more and more difficult to remain a Christian in this culture and in this country. And it may not be persecution, but it may be pressure to give a little bit. It may not be killing, it may not be captivity, but it's the pressure to fit into society. Compromise a little bit so that you're not a Jesus freak, right? We have to struggle to balance this faith, but this tension between following God and following him only and then doing what culture pressures us to do, but I don't really think it's a balance. Because I think what we see here from Revelation 13 is you follow God and the results work themselves out. You follow God and everything else just falls into place. What God was saying through John to the first century church is remain faithful and persevere through the trials. He's saying, stay strong when faced with losing your social engagement. Stay strong when faced with losing economic standing. Stay strong when faced with losing your image or your name or how people see you. Stay strong when faced with captivity or with death. God says, remain faithful and persevere to these early Christians, not compromising and not giving in. And God says this to us today as well. Because at the end of the day, what is more important? At the end of the day, for us, what is more important? What is your mark, church? What are you marked with? What does your life show that you are devoted to, that you are committed to? How are you marked? Are you marked as a follower of God, as a follower of Jesus, or are you marked with something else? Are you marked as following something or someone else? What is more important at the end of the day? When push comes to shove and you have to stand up and say, I'm a follower of, what is your mark, church? Is it loyalty to God or is it loyalty to something else? Is it loyalty to God or a company? Is it loyalty to God or a career? Is it loyalty to God or a paycheck? Is it loyalty to God or a neighborhood or a friend? Is it loyalty to God or family? Is it loyalty to God or our nice retirement? Is it loyalty to God or the Republican Party? Is it loyalty to God or the Democratic Party? Is it loyalty to God or the USA? Because I think sometimes we struggle with this. It's loyalty to God until I need to stand up and be American. And then it's suddenly loyalty to America first. Or it's loyalty to my company first. Or it's loyalty to my paycheck first. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, church, what is more important? Is it loyalty to God or is it loyalty to something else? What is your mark? Whatever you are marked with, it's clear to people around you. It's clear by what you do. It's clear by what you say. It's clear by how you act, who or what your allegiance is, what you live for, what defines you. We can't fake it. It is clear what we are marked with. Words are not enough. We are marked by how we live our lives. And church, what is your mark? As you interact and as you walk around and people see you and they interact with you and they learn about you, what are you marked with? Is it God or is it something else?